Yeah,
because the teaching profession is like this, so it's a disturb the stomach thought
correct,
as well.
correct. I understand. So let's make a quick start. I've got everything now, so I'm going to basically look at sharing. You what you see essentially on the screen right now is the unit specification, and what we are looking at today is basically covering learning outcome two. And in learning outcome two, before we go on, basically looks at understanding the concept of why businesses are adapting, sustainable practices. That is why that is the most important question, that we have to answer today is that why businesses, are adapting sustainable practices.
Yes.
And if we are able to answer this particular question, then it will give us an insight into some of the assessment criteria which are there that we also need to cover. One being the scope of the sustainable business within the organization, because not all businesses can essentially drive the sustainability agenda. So, for example, if we look at services business, or if we look at a business which is basically utilizing uh, you know it is basically selling or reselling some of the services online, then in some cases sustainability, definitions of sustainability and adapting sustainable practices are still being written. Obviously, internet based businesses, e-commerce businesses, might not have to drive that agenda because they do not directly contribute to, say, global warming or climate change. But yes, if we look at the activities that they do in terms of usage of PCs and usage of electricity and the resources which they are using to be able to drive the business, can be seen in directly contributing to climate change. So we look at a scope. We'll understand how do we determine the scope, whether sustainability can be on the company's agenda or can be on company's overall agenda of the organization or not. And the second assessment criteria that we want to look at is understand the impact of the business structure. So typically organizations, as globalization has happened over the last 2 3 decades, what we do see is that organizations have now offices and operations in very many different countries. So having an optimum structure of the business in terms of driving the business in various locations, does it have an impact on sustainable practices or sustainability of practices which the organization is trying to maintain in order to drive the agenda forward? Now, under sustainability, we typically would also look at things like corporate social responsibility, water conservation, looking at sending less material to landfill, recycling. We'll be looking at major objectives of if the company does produce or have activities which basically look at mining or something in terms of it's a primary business. So there is a classification of different types of businesses as well. So when we look at primary business, they are basically producing goods and services which are dug out from the earth or use raw materials from the earth. Secondary businesses, typically tend to be reusing some part of that output which has been produced, and they then look at, then selling it onwards to consumer. And then there are tertiary businesses, which typically would mean essentially here that they use a combination of both the activities of, either using the output of the secondary business, or in some cases, using a combination of primary, secondary to be able to sell products and services onwards to consumers. So a primary business could be an agriculture business. A secondary business could be iron ore business, for example, or some as a company, somebody is manufacturing construction, for example, of houses. They are a part of a secondary business because they would be using the raw material like cement, iron ore, and other things produced by companies or factories in the primary sector, to be able to then use them to produce goods and services. So primary, secondary, and tertiary sector typically tends to be the classification of businesses. And in some cases, when we look at them in particular, what we'll be looking at is how does the structure of how the business essentially works, can affect the sustainability agenda within the organization. Now, in terms of the learning content, when we look at, there is some part of it which will cover, uh, you know, the concepts of triple bottom line that we discussed very briefly last time. And also we'll be looking at going into, understanding what are the initiatives which, can be taken by the organizations to help in driving this sustainability, agenda for the organization. So we'll need to look at taking up an organization to discuss, some of the criterias, because what we have to do is basically look at when it says determine and it looks at evaluate. Here we need to be looking at specific examples to be able to then provide evidence and conclude and make a judgment that this is how, sustainability can be driven by a business within this particular sector. Now, to discuss this, we will look at some slides that I've got, in terms of presentation. And what we will do is start off by, discussing something in terms of key terminology and look at some of the aspects of, let's say the indicative content. So let me just put and insert one slide here, key terminology. So one of the things that we want to look at initially is to understand, why do businesses or why businesses are adapting, say, for example, sustainable practices. This is one such question which comes to my mind that we need to look at, answering before we go into any sort of, discussion on the concept of sustainable business organization. Now, when we look at why businesses are increasingly adopting sustainable practices, there could be a number of reasons. One such reason that I think of could be, government legislation. So it could be, say, for example, government legislation, which is being driven by, say, for example, COP26, the climate change, agenda. And those kind of things are what we are looking at is, say, for example, climate change. And these kind of agendas would be driving, say, for example, businesses to adapt sustainable practices. There could be, say, for example, other reasons which I can think of, which could be, for example, raised customer awareness, which would, say, influence, which may influence choices, let's say, which may influence the decision-making criteria. So a lot of customers are now becoming environmental, savvy, and they want to be looking at buying goods and services which are going to promote, sustainable environment, or essentially something which is not going to lead to, say, pollution or, destroying the natural environment. They would be looking at, say, for example, today what we see is a lot of people want to eat organic fruit and veg. So what they're looking at is fair farming as a concept, and the farmer receiving a fair price for the trade. And in this case, if you're buying something like, a dozen bananas or some fruit and veg, or if you're buying milk from the supermarket, then there are products which are now clearly labeled which says fair trade, and that would mean the farmer who's actually farming and is being paid a fair price for the products that you are buying from the supermarket. So in this case, raised awareness could be an example why businesses could be seen to adopt, sustainable practices. Now, other areas that I would think of generally would be, say, reputation. This is seen maybe as a point, because today, if customers are looking at, reputation, and I would say customer attraction, I would put, or retention, I would put as, together, because in some cases, some businesses might be losing customers if they are seen to be non-environmentally friendly. And in those cases, customers would shun buying their products. So that is why companies would look at adopting sustainable business practices, wherein they would like to attract or retain some of their customers, by showing that they are committed to eco-friendly policies and values that they drive, or practices that they drive within the organization. Now, there could be other reasons which you think of in terms, could be that if there are businesses which are, say, for example, using natural resources to produce goods and services. Now, if the business uses natural resources, then generally, because of government legislation, I would say generally because of government legislation, the businesses would be required to have what are called environmental, responsibility. That would mean that they have the responsibility to essentially maintain the natural environment. So in some cases, it could be, for example, when we look at, in this case, plastics in ocean, there are 400 million tons of plastics in ocean. At some stage, some research by Greenpeace and some of the voluntary organizations predict that there'll be more plastic in ocean than the fish by 2040. So when we look at this particular concept of packaged water, which is produced by Pepsi and Coca-Cola and some of the other brands, when we look at their responsibility that they basically sell packaged water, and in some countries like Sweden, Finland, and Denmark, the government has introduced initiatives wherein when you buy a bottle of packaged water or a soft drink, you pay 10p, 10 cents as a deposit for returning the bottle back to the recycling facility. So when a lot of people in these countries, and obviously a legislation which has been passed, and this is helping to reduce the plastic which goes into oceans through our rivers and streams and things like that. So this is a welcome initiative which obviously increases the price of, say, packaged water or Coca-Cola by €1.10 or £1.10. But when you return that bottle back to a recycling facility, you get a 10-penny refund from that machine when you deposit that bottle back. So it could be seen as a responsibility for organizations which are using natural resources to produce goods and services and then sell it to customers, because of government legislation, increased customer awareness, to adopt what is called the sustainability agenda. And in those cases, what we would generally see is that businesses would be keen on adapting, sustainable practices. And there could be other reasons. There could be many other reasons. Can you think of any other reasons? And I would put it this way: there could be many other reasons for adapting the sustainability agenda. Now, if I go forward and I look at a couple of other reasons, it could be, say, for example, company might be looking at cost savings. It could be, for example, long-term perspective in terms of long-term viability of the business. So when I talk about if there is going to be increased awareness of government and policy and incentives being provided to buy electric vehicles, then some companies like Volkswagen have already announced that they will cease production of diesel and petrol cars by 2030. So that would mean if somebody wants to buy a car after that, they would not have the option to buy a diesel or a petrol car from Volkswagen, and they would have to choose an electric vehicle. So in some cases, some of these choices would be also forcing customers and businesses to look at sustainability from a long-term perspective. Now, the meaning and connotation of what sustainability means and sustainable practices means for a particular company or organization may differ. But we are generally and broadly discussing here that why are businesses adopting sustainable practices. So the next question would be, depending on what sustainable practices can the business adopt. Now, this would depend on the type of business and the sector in which the business operates to look at what would be the practices that they would need to adopt, which are conducive for their business, which are meeting their goals and long-term mission of the organization. So when I talk about, say, for example, Marks and Spencer, and if I take an example of Marks and Spencer here, Marks and Spencer introduced Plan A, which was a 10-year plan to make the business, more, say, carbon neutral, essentially. So this particular plan looks at, reducing the amount of, say, for example, Marks and Spencer are different categories of business. So if I look at Marks and Spencer, let me try and see if I can pull out an image. Marks and Spencer, if we look at, in terms of various types of businesses that it does, it has, say, for example, clothing business. It has, the home business, which is where it sells a lot of home-related products. It has, business wherein it sells Marks and Spencer food, and it has, say, for example, interests in, for example, finance, because it has a Marks and Spencer bank, insurance, lots of different types of, things which Marks and Spencer does. Now, when Marks and Spencer introduced Plan A, one of the things why they introduced or launched Plan A was that they wanted to save the planet. So we have one planet, And because we have one planet, what they did was they introduced a plan which was signed off by the management, and which, as a result of this plan, wants to basically make the business carbon neutral. That means they want to essentially ensure that all the activities, all the business activities which Marks and Spencer does, do not lead to any carbon emissions. So this planning was put in place because, one, the organization wants to show that it is genuinely interested in preserving the environment. It also wants to build its reputation and look at this as a strategy to differentiate itself from other competitors in the market, that by looking at becoming carbon neutral or having a net zero, then what the company is looking at doing is making sure that anything that it uses, like electricity, its stores uses, the stores are large stores in whatever location it has in 14 different countries. Each of that store has a large carbon footprint. So they want to produce their own electricity. They want to reduce the material going to landfill. They want to recycle. When they look at food, they want to look at less and less of clothes being sent to the landfill. They want to look at recycling some of the products to be able to then sell them in other countries, wherein it could be seen as giving as a part of working with charities to ensure that they are also helping out in those countries wherein there is a deficiency of some of these products, and used products or refurbished products can be sold in those countries as a part of a charitable program under their particular planning. So when we look at this particular journey, the company is committed to meeting certain milestones. And when it looks at meeting certain milestones, it needs to adapt the practices which are going to be suitable for its business. It won't probably adapt a practice wherein, for example, if the business does not burn or use fossil fuels, there is no point in including that into their agenda of sustainability or saving the planet, because that is something they do not do. But when they look at use of electricity, look at material being sent to landfill, clothes being sent to landfill, recycling is a option or an alternative that can be used to do those activities, and that is what they have based their planning on. Now, if I go into the reason I'm going into this is because this will also be looking at giving us details of how Marks and Spencer essentially looks at driving planning. So when we look at, say, for example, their planning, and we look at when they estimated that what is the amount of, say, for example, carbon emission, or what is the amount of, emissions and, let's say, contribution to global house warming, so through the greenhouse house gases, what does their solar operations or different operations or businesses contribute to global warming? So when we look at this, they did an estimate that way back when they had created a particular plan, what they did was that they estimated that the amount of carbon emissions which Marks and Spencer and its operations emits in a particular year is 336,000 tons. Now, part of this comes from warehousing, some part of this comes from transport, and they further broke it down into gas, electric, and refrigeration, because when they transport food across different stores, obviously that means they're using refrigeration or trucks which basically are using refrigeration, and in those cases, that would mean that they would need to look at incorporating that into the aspect as well. So this particular bit, going into this detail, is actually given on this particular link of the website, and this is where they calculated that if we have to become carbon neutral, if we have to have net zero emissions, then what the business needs to do is basically look at its logistics carbon footprint, which is about 85% of the total emissions, and the warehousing footprint, which is about 15% of its operations, because these are the two places wherein a lot of movement and dependency on electricity, gas, and transportation in terms of fossil fuels is required to move products from one location to the other. And if they are able to tackle this emission, then they would be looking at moving very closer to their plan of achieving net zero or zero carbon emissions by 2025. Now, this is looking at in detail why a company would need to adopt sustainable business practices, because if it streamlines its operations in terms of warehousing, creates warehouses locally in different locations, or reduces the number of stores, goes online. They looked at a lot of different objectives through which they would be able to reduce this, and they came up with this idea that, okay, if we have to look at adopting some of these practices, we need to look at more research in terms of finding out where the consumer is, where the company wants to expand, where the business is coming from, which business is going to increase in the future, which business is going to decline. And after all this study, they then came up with this particular plan that they would need to reinvest resources in some of these businesses to make the net or make the carbon emission zero, or basically follow this path to essentially at some stage achieve a net zero in its operation in terms of carbon emissions. So it looked at identifying those businesses where it produces this, carbon or, usage of fossil fuels, gas and more of gas and electricity. And it identified foods business, it identified its clothing business, and some of the stores which it felt are not doing that well, and it will be profitable for the company to close some of these stores in the long run and divert traffic elsewhere or online. And that would be one, it will not only end up saving cost, but it will also help in driving the agenda forward for net zero as far as Marks and Spencer is concerned. So when we look at any such business, we will need to look into going into details of understanding what are the major operational areas where the business actually uses or looks at emissions. And in those areas, it would need to find alternatives of how it can reduce this to net zero. Now, give an example in terms of how did Marks and Spencer look at reducing carbon emissions. So what it has done, the fleet of trucks that it has, or when it moves goods from one warehouse to the other, it has started to invest in what is called electric vehicles. And these electric vehicles basically mean that they do not contribute anything towards global warming or carbon emissions through fossil fuel burning. But yes, they still require battery charging, and charging of battery comes from hydroelectric power or nuclear power, and that is still contributing to carbon emissions. But what they're doing at the first stage is trying to reduce or replace some of these options, which would allow it to essentially reduce its carbon footprint at source. And then slowly and gradually it will look at other alternatives, because some of these alternatives also require heavy investment, change of plans. And obviously, when we look at this from a short-term perspective, some of these are directly proportional to the investment which the company does in taking out or working with alternatives. And that might not happen over time, because a lot of reinvestment has to be done in alternative products to be able to, drive revenue from it. And that is why this is a 10-year plan or a 20-year plan. Yes, Kuram, you were wanting to ask a question. Any questions so far?
No.
Okay. So this is basically looking at covering one or two quick questions which talk about what is sustainability, concept of sustainability, why do you think sustainability businesses are wanting to drive? And if businesses look at adopting the sustainable business practices, how would they tailor these practices or the adoption of some of these practices to suit the nature of their own business? And that is where we would need to take up an example. And I've just done a small discussion with regards to Marks and Spencer. Now, there are two videos which I want you to look at understanding. One is a roundtable discussion, which is in this particular video. And I'll play that very briefly because it's quite a long video of about 7 or 8 minutes. This is something that I would suggest that you watch offline, is why companies are putting sustainable business strategies first. So it basically begs the same question that we were looking at answering, is that why are businesses today focused on, driving the, sustainability agenda? And what is it in for businesses to have this agenda as far as where, you know, their own operations are concerned. So I'll briefly show this to you in terms of this particular video, because this particular video would give you some insight into some of the points that we have discussed, but there would be other points which might come up in that discussion, because it's a roundtable discussion which is happening amongst you know, some of the companies management, and they are basically discussing how do we embed you know, sustainability at the heart of the brand. So it's a roundtable you know, which has been recorded, and I think it's about a 7-minute video, but let's listen in for a few seconds.
I think the first thing you've got to ask yourself is why is it important now? And I think for us it's important because our customers are interested in sustainable solutions. And you know, there's a number of surveys that have been undertaken that UK consumers are willing to pay on average 25% more for what they see as a sustainable packaging solution. So there's a commercial reason for doing it. I think when we look at our customers, so we're a B2B customer, so our customers are demanding that we challenge ourselves on what we do and how we do it. Investors are interested in understanding what is your sustainable journey, what is your purpose, what is your reason for being. Our supply chain, our suppliers want to partner and innovate with companies that are interested in driving and challenging themselves on what they do and how they do it. And finally, employees. It is far easier to attract talent to your business if they feel that you are not just manufacturing a product, but that you have a purpose and a reason for being.
You know, we've started from a place where it's everything. It's about everything. You know, sustainability is crucial to who we are in our DNA. But actually, you know, building that up, you know, creates its challenges. You know, as soon as your volumes, you know, if you're manufacturing apparel, your volume's going up, you've got to think of a lot more things. And you know, so we know there's always more to do. We know we're not the finished article in any shape or form. And you know, I think we're probably different from some brands in that, you know, we're very clear on who we are and what we're trying to achieve, but we're not necessarily going to go out and become a campaigning brand, because that's not who we are. You know, we're very much, we want to be a role model for how we see it going.
So this is one video which shows a bit of perspective of, you know, different CEOs talking why they want to drive sustainability. There's another one that I've also put up on the slide.
The best time for any.
Which basically is, you know, why sustainability is becoming important in businesses which are basically in supply chain. And they seem to be the biggest contributors to, for example, carbon house emissions of gases.
I would say that now is probably the best time.
And this particular video that I put forward is a video which is produced in association with the Warwick Business School. And the professor here is actually you know, highlighting how do supply chain companies in supply chain should manage their carbon footprint and why they should look at sustainability. So again, this is a video which I wouldn't play in full, but just very briefly, let's listen in for a couple of seconds to say what the video talks about.
For anyone to be involved in this space of sustainability, because there is so much demand from accountancy bodies, from the investment community, from government regulators and civil society. So those students who came to me to talk about sustainability, who wrote dissertations about sustainability, they found themselves almost at the cutting edge of some of the latest developments, and it really enabled them to change their companies, to work with CEOs, boards of directors, their supply chains. And to me, it certainly reflects the big impact that our students and our colleagues can make by talking about sustainability and looking at this. Those companies that have...
So here in this particular video, I think what you would get is a sense of why this has also become a burning discussion within universities and academia in general. And this particular discussion seems to be driving, you know, sustainable business practices within different organizations when people are coming fresh off studying or are undertaking research in terms of why sustainability is important. And that would give you another perspective in terms of why businesses are looking at adopting, sustainable business practices. So these are two good videos to watch in terms of, although there are some other videos which I also want to put together, which are, one is a video on from TED Talk, which talks about what is carbon footprint and how do we calculate and reduce our carbon footprint. This is something which a lot of airline agencies, airlines and airline-related businesses and agencies, look at propagating. So that could be another video that you could watch. But essentially, it is around individual organization and how they could contribute in terms of reducing or helping the environment essentially, sustain itself. That means their business activities are not going to be detrimental to the environmental activities or some of the natural environment, and it would help in preserving the natural environment in and around us for future generations. Now, with this understanding, let's go into some of the assessment criteria. So the first one talks about determining the scope of sustainable business organizations. So when we talk about, determining the scope, what we need to look at some stage would be to understand, the key part, which is what we have just covered very briefly in terms of what is, according to a business, sustainability. So when we talk about a business, sustainability to a business would refer to as maybe a company strategy to reduce negative impact on the environment, which could be, resulting from the operations or some of the activities it carries out in the market or in terms of producing the goods and services that it sells to the consumers. So from a point of view of looking at understanding what does this mean, you would also see that some organizations have what is called a sustainability policy. And the reason why they've created this sustainability policy is that a lot of organizations want their employees, their staff, contractors, suppliers to all speak the same, meaning of when sustainability for a business comes up as a topic. So when we look at sustainable business policy or sustainability policy within an organization, that is a holistic approach which the organization is trying to acquire so that whosoever is, asked about this as a topic, they have similar understanding and answers to be given out when we talk about the aspect of how the company is trying to reduce any negative impact that its operations are having on the environment. Now, if I take an example of Pepsi and I talk about packaged water, their reducing the negative impact on the environment would be to look at reducing waste in terms of plastic bottles, looking at coming out with ingenious ways of looking at how they can recycle most of the plastic bottles which are basically sold when packaged water is sold. So there are 1 billion bottles of packaged water sold just in the UK every year. Now, imagine if this can be recalled back by the company which are selling this particular product, and they can recycle some of this to be able to reuse and then put it back into the ecosystem, would be helping to reduce the negative impact these companies are having on, environment. So when we go back to discussing sustainability, and what we discussed generally was the definition of the Brundtland report, and it talked about, the sustainability from an aspect of 3 fundamental principles, or pillars. It talked about environmental impact, social impact, and economic impact. And this was further refined into what we discussed is the triple bottom line fact. And when we talk about the triple bottom line, this, essentially looked at, the 3 pillars, but these pillars were changed into what is now seen as planet, people, and essentially profits. So when we look at these as concepts, and when we look at why companies want to drive, say, for example, the concept of sustainability, we would need to look at taking examples of why is it important for a business to consider, the aspect of sustainability or sustainable agenda from within their organizational point of view. Now, what we see in terms of how do we determine this scope, what we are looking at is because of the rapid economic growth which is happening across the world and in various economies and countries, what we do see is that this economic growth is basically having a direct impact on how some of the business activities are affecting the natural environment. So if we talk about a call center business, a call center business might not be directly contributing to global warming, but the number of PCs installed, if there are 200 agents in a particular call center business, or it runs 3 shifts, for example, 8-hour shifts, you have 250 employees working, 250 PCs switched on. The amount of electricity which is being used by the business in order to provide these services, the use of internet and the use of electricity would be indirectly contributing to global warming. So when we look at the economic aspect of how, although some companies might say that we don't have the business operating here, what they've done is they've outsourced the operations to countries like India, Vietnam, or countries elsewhere in the Far East, wherein they are able to get cheaper costs and also move this to a 24/7 kind of an operation. They are still contributing to what is called global warming. Now they are shifting the effect of what they contribute towards carbon emissions from one location to the other. And this is also sometimes referred to when we look at wanting to determine the scope of what the business activities of the, what activities of the business actually is contributing towards, negative environmental impact. And that is what we want to determine. So how do we determine this? We will determine this by basically looking at understanding what is the environmental impact of the activities of the business that it carries out. So say, for example, in this case, the environmental impact of the call center business is going to be additional resource, consumption, which is, more of electricity. You look at a data warehousing business, a lot of these large companies, which are seen as software companies like Facebook, LinkedIn, Microsoft, they have Google, they have lots of data centers, and these data centers store, data of millions and billions of customers. Now, these data warehouses or data centers are essentially being run in different locations. They are power hungry. They require a lot of electricity. And, and because they have so many PCs and servers running together, in order to maintain and run the data center, they need to be in an air-conditioned or temperature-cooled environment, controlled environment. And that temperature-controlled environment requires constant use of electricity, keeping them cool, and also look at the number of PCs or servers or IT-related devices which are connected in that data center to keep it, up and running. So there could be 10,000 PCs, 20,000 PCs, servers in a particular data center. Now, when we look at that, they are contributing to increased consumption of electricity. That is somewhere being generated through hydroelectric power, nuclear power, wind energy, whatever it is, but it is contributing and having a net impact on the environment. And that is leading to emission of greenhouse gases, if not at the source, where the data center is only using electricity. But in some cases, when we talk about, some of these data centers also using solar panels to generate electricity. But when they start doing that, and 100% of it is being sustained through the solar energy, then in those cases, this particular data center becomes carbon neutral. That means there are no particular greenhouse gases emissions which are contributing to, global warming, but the data center is self-sustainable because it is using a solar farm or solar energy essentially required to be able to run its operations. So the net environmental impact has to be studied depending on the type and scope of business that you choose. And that would help you determine what would be the scope of sustainable business practices which are being adopted within that particular organization. Is that okay? Is that clear?
Yes.
Yeah. Now,
Yes.
in terms of taking another example, if we look at Nestle and Coca-Cola, now they have, as companies, they would not be able to reduce their net emissions to zero. So in some cases, what they are looking at is they are adopting environmental sustainable environmental practices, and these practices that they're adopting are by creating policies and agendas at the company level. That means they are incorporating this into their vision, mission, and also their long-term and short-term plans of the organization. And that is to say, when Nestle and Coca-Cola, for example, look at environmental policies, one of the things that they want to look at is they want to look at paying a fair price to its farmers. When they look at, asking farmers to produce a particular type of product for their business, which is used as a raw material, they want to ensure that these farming practices are being done in a sustainable manner. That means crop rotation or some of the things that they would allow the farmers to do would be convenient and also conducive for them and the environment, because this would mean less use of fertilizers or some of the chemicals which are required to produce some of the goods. So when we look at agriculture in general and we look at these FMCG companies, they are basically working hand in hand now by including the agenda of sustainability within their organizational mission to drive it at the source, because they buy a lot of material which is coming from a primary business like agriculture business, and that is where they're helping to drive the sustainable business practices, which would basically show and help reduce any sort of emissions which are being which are a contribution coming from them, because they are happening at the source and they are using primary output, which is basically usage of the natural environment and the natural resources in general to be able to produce those goods and services. Now, if I give that example and take it further, in terms of how some of these are being done. So when we look at the International Standards Organization, they've introduced now, certification like ISO 14001, OSAS 18001, and ISO 22000, which are basically policies and certifications which companies are applying to show that their businesses achieve this certification, which means that their business is now not having any negative impact on the natural environment, and the natural resources they use in terms of producing goods and services being sold to consumers in the market are actually compliant with the sustainability laws in different countries and operations that they run are concerned. Now, when we look at an example of Nestle and in its environmental performance indicators in Latin America, which is where you have the Amazon rainforest in South America, you would see that it has created a vision which primarily is looking at driving, different forms of sustainability within different types of businesses that it runs in that particular continent. So it is helping. And if we go back to these three fundamental pillars of what does sustainability do and how does it contribute, how does an organization contribute to the agenda of sustainability, we have to look at environmental, social, and economic factors. And when we look at this, they've included this into their long-term plan. So when we look at no poverty, that part is basically related to, social aspect of the business driving no poverty in that continent. When you look at zero hunger, that means it is driving a social agenda. So they have adopted sustainability and the three pillars of sustainability into their business. Good health and well-being, that means they're going to produce products which are going to lead to healthy well-being, kind of a routine within individuals or customers which buy their product. They're looking at promoting quality education, gender equality, reduced inequalities, responsible consumption and production. They are looking at contributing towards climate action. They want to look at life below water, which is what they have termed as, that means they want to preserve the oceans. They want to look at life on land, that means preserve the natural resources. And they want to look at partnerships with similar companies, charities, organizations to be able to achieve these goals which have been set in its particular, agenda for sustainability. So this particular aspect of the company adopting everything at the root, and then publishing a report every year, including it in the annual general report, shows as an example that how does the business determine the scope of sustainable practices and how does it adapt those practices within its business to drive this agenda, in the short term and in the long term. Is that okay? So
Yeah.
I've taken two examples in particular, one Coca-Cola and the other Nestle, and they would essentially highlight by looking at understanding what organization have chosen, what are the operations of that organization, what products and services it sells to consumers, and where are those services when they are being sold contribute to negative effect on the environment. And those areas wherein the negative effect can happen will contribute towards the company forming that or incorporating that into its sustainability agenda as far as the organization objectives are concerned. So in the case of Coca-Cola and Nestle, waste is a big issue. That means they produce a lot of waste. And as I mentioned earlier, packaged water, 98% of the waste produced by Coca-Cola, primarily by selling their beverages in terms of soft drinks, packaged water, and some of the other products which they sell, include what is called packaging waste. And these packaging waste containers or secondary packaging which they need to do to be able to ship their products from one warehouses to the other or from warehouses to the end consumer outlets into large supermarkets contribute to waste production, and that would be waste in the form of glass, plastic, film, or packaging, and they would essentially need to be recycled. Now, if Coca-Cola is able to recycle some of that to manage that particular waste, it would be following a sustainability agenda by driving recycling or putting recycling at the center of its agenda of sustainability. And that would be seen as one of the examples of how it determines the scope, where it produces the waste, how this waste can be, essentially, say, minimized or can be essentially, recycled. And this recycling of that waste would allow the company to have a cleaner environmental, carbon footprint, or essentially reducing the negative impact of, let's say, waste on the natural environment. Is that okay?
Yeah, it's okay.
Okay, so let's look at the second assessment criteria, which talks about evaluating the impact of business structure. So here, what we want to be able to look at is two different aspects of, looking at understanding sustainable practices. One is, what is the impact of business structure on a business becoming, a sustainable business? So when we look at this as an option, what we are looking at is how does the company shift from, shift its business model or makes a change in its business models in a way that it can address the root cause of negative impact that it's having on the natural environment. That means it could be climate change, it could be carbon dioxide emissions, it could be waste, it could be, for example, material being sent to landfill, or in general, leading to wastage by the production of its goods and services. Now, when I look at giving an example of, say, waste, what tends to happen is that, for example, Marks and Spencer dining or food is considered fine dining in the UK and lots of other locations where, Marks and Spencer has its food and dining stores. Now, when the food actually is prepared and it is served, it has a bit of a shelf life. Now, if it does not estimate the amount of sales that it will do from a particular location and not gets it right for a couple of, not gets it right, and then basically a lot of this ends up being sent as waste to landfill, then it is having two impacts. One, the food is being wasted, which is being overproduced on the anticipation that it will sell. And the second is that the preparation of the food and the time and effort being sent by chefs and the company and the organization in terms of transportation, warehousing, storage is also leading to a waste, because at the end of the day, that food is being sent to the landfill because it cannot be consumed, it is expired, or it has a shelf life. So when a company looks at having, or when the company looks at, for example, making a change to drive or have a positive impact on, ensuring that this particular wastage is reduced, then in those cases, what the company would be looking at is looking at the structure of how the business or the output of this particular product is being done, and what are the factors which are informing that this is the amount of the volume or the amount required for it to be produced, to be sold, and this would be then minimizing anything which is being sent across as waste to landfill. So when we look at this aspect of company realizing that this is not working or this needs to change, and it looks at making a change to adapt to the root causes of why this is not happening, then is where it will start to look at, let's say, going into details of understanding the restructuring of the business. Now, we have seen this or heard this term restructuring. Why do you think the business looks at restructuring? One, it could be not making enough profit. It could be that the customer requirements and the way customer buy these products or services has moved on and the company is not kept in pace with the times. It could be looking at restructuring because it feels that competition is caught up with it. There are lots of other Me Too products available at a cheaper option, cheaper price, and that is where consumers are going. It could look at restructuring because that business is no longer profitable for the company. And it could also look at restructuring because it needs to restructure the business to primarily make it more profitable, make it lean, mean, and smarter. So sometimes when we see that companies now are looking at automation or introducing automation in some part of their business and, let's say supply chain, the reason they are looking at doing this is because they feel automation would reduce, the dependence on manual labor. It would in some places introduction of machines would make the operations much more efficient and productive. It might end up saving time, and in some cases it might also look at restructuring because it feels that the restructuring is primarily required because the business model has to be changed, and the business model which the company is following is maybe outdated, and that is why they would look at restructuring. So when we look at this aspect of business restructuring, they would be looking at taking into account all these aspects of how the business would, the restructured business would basically be meeting the sustainability agenda within the organization. And when we look at evaluating the impact of business structure and the objectives of the company looking at becoming a more sustainable organization or a business organization, here they would be looking at considering things like, after the restructuring, what and how would the business operations become better? Would the business operations become more profitable? Would the business operations become more productive and efficient? And would it become more positive in the eyes of its consumers? And would it give the business a competitive advantage against its own competitors? It could also look at understanding the impact of business from business ethics point of view. That means if customers, and I gave you an example earlier that fair trade is what a lot of customers look at today when they buy organic goods and service products. So when you look at fruit and veg and you look at some of the grocery products, a lot of customers are now looking at buying organic versions of the products. That means if I look it into a bit more detail, what that would mean is that farmers which are producing the goods are getting a fair price for their services. This fair price is being reflected into usage of, more of natural resources rather than use of fertilizers and other bits, because it means that because you're paying a higher price, then it allows some of these, let's say the farmers to produce some of these goods in the usual time frame that they would normally be produced under natural conditions, rather than using artificial conditions of fertilizers or chemicals to be able to increase production. And that would drive the cycle of what is called business ethics. So here it would be looking at the company values, looking at the restructuring of the business which the company wants to do, but at the same time looking at the objectives that the restructuring would help it to meet when it looks at environmental issues and the negative impact of the business that and operations it has on the environment, and at the same time driving the social and the economic dimensions. So the social dimensions of that, again going back to the 3 pillars of sustainability, would be looking at the fair price, the morals, the ethics, the fairness of it. And economic side of things would primarily be looking at getting a slightly higher price. And as we looked at very briefly in that video, the person was mentioning that UK customers on average are willing to pay 25% extra if the business is seen to be, employing sustainable business practices to produce those goods and services. So when we look at the concept of the 3 pillars of sustainability and why the business needs to structure its operations in a way when it is meeting the objectives of the sustainable business practices, they could be driven by customer requirements, they could be driven by competitor requirements or demands, and it could be because also that there are impacts, there is an impact on the business practices happening because the changing consumer demands and preferences are mandating the business to incorporate the sustainable business practices agenda into its company's long-term objectives. So here the shift may include reducing carbon emissions, conserving resources or natural resources, looking at promoting social responsibility, and also fostering ethical business practices, which is looking at the ethics in terms of being moral, being fair, and being equal in procuring those natural resources required or natural raw material required to be able to produce your goods and services. So in general, when we talk about the company becoming or having a sustainable agenda, then we'll be piggybacking on, looking at the 3 pillars of sustainability, and to a certain extent also lean into the triple bottom line concept, which would suggest that the businesses looking at its own structure and its objectives should be looking at measuring their success not only in terms of profits, which is basically the economic pillar, but also in terms of social and environmental terms. And that would be looking at, basically helping us understand the impact of business structure in its its objectives on the sustainable agenda of the business. Now, one other thing which I'd also like to put here would be that when we look at large FMCG companies, because the sustainability agenda can be very, very, specific to an organization depending on its size, scale, and, the operations that it does in terms of production of goods and services being sold to consumers. In those cases, when we look at FMCG companies, they would be more keen in driving the corporate social responsibility framework as against the sustainability framework. They would adopt sustainable practices within their business structure, but would be seen to be driving corporate social responsibility agenda because they would emphasize the company's responsibility to society, including the employees, suppliers, partners, customers, anybody which is involved in their business. So what the company would be here, focusing on would be by following the CSR framework to emphasize on the company's responsibility to society, and also showing that they've included sustainable practices and ethical behavior into the long-term agenda of the organization. So in some cases, when I looked at this particular point that I made, if I put this slide, just put this as a bit of a snapshot here as well. So when we look at a company driving some of these sustainable business practices, what it will be doing is driving them from an aspect of the 3 pillars, which is basically, economics, the social, and the environmental. But how would you see these being, doled out? That means how would you see these being actually implemented within the organization? They would be seen implemented within the organization through the agenda of corporate social responsibility for some of these large FMCG organizations, because they would want to emphasize that as a company, we are responsible to the society, but we are also responsible for the environment and following the sustainable practices agenda, we are able to provide, benefits to the society, like no poverty, zero hunger, or good and quality education, but at the same time drive economic benefits for the company, and thereby looking at conserving the environment as well, or having a negative minimal negative impact on the natural environment. And that is where these companies are looking at preserving, climate, or helping in preserving the climate, or reducing global warming, life, or essentially the life in oceans, and also life on land. And this is an example of how I would suggest that we tackle this particular task, because this would be looking at the business structure, but also looking at the agenda or the framework which the company looks at driving to achieve sustainable business practices through the route of corporate social responsibility, and how the business then structures, its own operations, with Nestle's operation in Latin America focusing on these, 17 objectives. They've got 17 different objectives of driving sustainability, but they're focused on, these 6 plus 11 objectives within Latin America, and then incorporating these objectives into various operations of the business within Latin America would be looking at driving the, sustainability as a objective within the organization. So in the end, what I would suggest is that when we look at a business becoming more sustainable and looking at controlling its negative impact on the natural environment, it would need to look at both its structure in terms of how the business actually operates. So when I say business, Nestle, for example, might be having 10 different factories in Latin America, which would be producing maybe, say, 200 different types of goods. So what it will do is look at the operations of the factory, excuse me, and look at where it can reduce wastage in those factories. So that is looking at individual structure and operations of that particular factory or the business, and then meeting it with the long-term objectives of sustainability within the organization, and driving it forward with objectives. So driving it forward with objectives that it is then listing out, which are related to reducing the negative impact of the operations of the company on the environment, and also highlighting its social responsibility. Is that okay?
Yeah, it's okay.
Good stuff. So now this brings us to the end of our discussion today, with regards to this particular learning outcome, which is the concept of sustainable business organization. Now, in order to understand this in a bit more detail, what I would suggest is one or two good article reading. And this bit would be one of the articles which I would suggest is on Harvard Business Online. And it is a very basic article, which basically talks about what does sustainability mean for you in a business. So when we look at UK Versity, for example, as a training provider, as a college, what does it mean for me to look at sustainability as a concept within the business? So every organization would need to ask this particular question, and how they ask this particular question and how they look at doing this introspection is basically covered in this particular article. And it begs a few important questions to every owner, every top management, or anybody in the top management to discuss how do we look at incorporating. And I can't say that, my business, we don't need to look at sustainability, because it is the operations of the business do not have any negative impact on the environment.
Understood.
Now, we would need to look into by looking at this particular introspection, and that would be a good way of looking at, reading this particular article, and it helps you understand comprehensively, what is sustainability, for your own business. Now, there's another article which is also published. This is on Harvard Business Online HBS. And this particular article that I've put forward is a case study which basically puts a comprehensive case forward, for any business to look at sustainability. So these two articles should give a very good perspective on task 2.1 and task 2.2. And how does a business feel that, that we can develop sustainable business strategies, or basically look at business strategies for sustainable development of the business. And these are very good articles to read, primarily because of the fact that they would directly be related to your, learning assessment, your learning outcome 2 and some of the assessment criteria. And there is a particular handout which I'm also going to provide, and I'll just briefly show this to you, which will be available upon Moodle along with this updated version of the presentation. And this particular handout that I'm going to show essentially looks at, providing you a very good detail into what are business strategies which companies actually put into place when they look at taking up the agenda of sustainability. So this is based on an extract which has been taken out from a book which is called Business Strategy for Sustainable Development, Leadership and Accountability. And this extract of about 19 pages covers the agenda in a great amount of detail. So any detailing that you would need to primarily understand this from different business aspects and from a definition and theoretical prospect would essentially be coming from this particular handout. So if you read this handout as well, along with your learning outcome 2 presentation and the 2 articles that I'm suggesting, they would give you a very good perspective of the learning outcome 2, which is the concept of sustainable business organization and the role of leadership and management in driving that agenda.
Could you please here you speak about fair trade? So could you give me little explanation about this? What is this fair trade? What is the meaning of by this fair trade in this article?
Okay, so when we talk about fair trade in particular, there are lots of products now being sold on supermarket shelves and in general in various business categories wherein the term fair trade is now being used. Now, fair trade is a term which basically looks at an arrangement between, producers which are basically producing goods from the natural environment or raw material from the natural environment, and the companies which are basically using that natural resource to be able to produce goods and services being sold to customers. So this fair trade, concept or a movement essentially combines the, let's put it this way, the social, economic and environmental standards for companies and farmers, primarily in the agriculture, business, to say that the companies would be paying the farmers who are producing the goods or raw material required by these companies for producing the goods and services a fair price for the efforts that they put in to produce, the goods. So in the UK, for example, when I look at fair trade, just to give you an example, a lot of farmers produce milk, and the association which basically mediates that this should be the optimal price for fixing, per liter of milk, which companies like supermarkets and a lot of other companies which basically buy milk from farmers actually pay. They basically help in regulating this as a price, which is going to be conducive. Now, a couple of years back, what happened was in the news, a lot of farmers actually revolted. And they basically said that we will not sell milk at this price to the supermarkets because that is not sustainable for us. That means it is not producing any profits for us. It is actually making a loss for us in the business. And we do not want to be in this business. So what they did was they basically, used to get milk every day, but they used to drain it down to show as a mark of protest to say that they're not getting a fair price. So when we look at this particular aspect of fair price and fair, trade, this actually started off as a bit of a movement which guarantees that any product which companies buy from essentially farmers would mean that they are going to pay them a suitable price, which is going to be profitable for not just them, but also be profitable for the companies who are actually producing these goods and services. So this concept, of fair trade actually originated from there. Now, you could look at this being applied now to any such business which basically buys goods as raw material to be used as raw material to produce any finished goods that they sell to customers. So when you look at like companies like, for example, car manufacturing companies. Now, car manufacturing companies do not make the whole car themselves. They have lots of suppliers and partners. Now, when they look at having a supply chain, companies producing steel, tires, upholstery, things like that, they all come from outside the main factory. So in those cases, what you would generally see is the concept of, fair trade being applied, because if the suppliers are not going to be profitable, then the companies buying those goods, you would essentially mean that they are not paying a fair price to them for the services or the goods that they are producing. And this concept initially started off, whereby it ensures that all companies are getting a certain amount of margin to make their business viable. But generally speaking, when we talk about fair price and we talk about fair trade as a concept, this is more or less related to farmers, because when we look at large FMCG companies like Kraft, Nestle, Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Unilever, Procter & Gamble, they essentially buy a lot of raw material from agriculture-based businesses. And they have to pay a fair price for the businesses to be able to produce, farmers to be able to produce this year on year. And in some cases, what some companies have also done is that they do what is called, guaranteed farming with some of these producers or farmers. So they will give them everything, the seeds, the fertilizer, the chemicals, and the, whereabouts to be able to grow this on their piece of land. And in return, they will pay them a bit of a price after providing this when they buy the goods back for their own, purses, cases of consumption. You look at this happening for McDonald's when they produce the potatoes. They buy these potatoes and obviously chickens and other things from certain outlets or farming factories, and they provide all the raw material and everything in terms of investment to be able to then re-buy it back from them for the purposes of use in their own businesses. And that is where the concept of fair trade or fair price comes in, because they need to be able to, provide the supplier and provide enough, let's say, cover their cost so that their operations are profitable. And at the end, the operations can continue and the suppliers can continue supplying these goods and services to McDonald's. So that is where this concept of fair trade or fair price essentially comes in. Is that okay? Now, this is also, to a certain aspect, if you go into detail and go onto Wikipedia and read about this, this is more so true for FMCG companies, because companies which basically buy, say, for example, Starbucks is an example, because they buy a lot of coffee and cocoa beans. So they need to look at fair price in order to get, enough supplies and, pay the farmers fair price for producing the goods as per their requirement and the demand. You look at coffee, you look at flowers, for example, in Holland, in particular, when you look at tulips, they pay the farmers a fair price, and this is normally set by associations or, common neutral companies or agencies which basically monitor and maintain this as a practice, so that all the businesses are getting a fair share of the efforts that they are getting in terms of costs being reimbursed to them when they sell or, buy these services from farmers. So cotton, tea, sugar, flowers, cocoa, coffee, you look at banana, vanilla beans in Madagascar, that is where we see this fair trade products or prices being made applicable as far as, businesses are concerned. Is that okay?
Yes, okay. So actually, the fair trade meaning here is about the cost, the cost should be fair for the consumer and seller, or it's about the sustainability, or what? Actually, I want to know these things. The fair trade meaning it should follow this one sustainability, or while the trading of materials, or it should maintain the cost for consumer and seller both. So this I need to know only.
So fair trade is basically, the concept which applies between companies and, let's say companies or businesses which are producing goods and services which are being provided for production of, final finished goods. So it is a concept which is normally for, companies. It applies to companies and companies that work with other businesses to procure this raw material. So that is where the fair trade term actually applies in simple terms. It basically means that you are in a partnership with another business wherein you are being transparent, you are basically respecting the cost and the efforts which they are putting into the business to produce the raw material for you. And what you're doing in exchange is basically providing them better trading conditions or better prices so that they are able to carry on with their businesses as well.
Okay.
That is in simple terms, that is what it achieves. Fair trade achieves by looking at, making sure that the fair price is paid for the services that or products or services that you're getting from, your from your supplier or your partner. That is it. But when you look at applying this to sustainability, it becomes important because does the business remain sustainable? Does the business, make profits after paying such a high price for, say, for example, in some cases, why in developed countries, certain companies start outsourcing these services elsewhere because they feel that the cost is not going to be sustainable. So in some cases, sustainability also has an, economic output or economic value. And in those cases, giving a fair price or trading under a fair price practice makes the business unsustainable in terms of economic side of things. And that is where you see companies outsourcing these operations to cheaper locations, wherein the pound, for example, is able to create justification for running that operation in a particular country, but also helps in meeting, fair prices being paid to its partners and its suppliers for, in return, providing those services to the company.
Okay, nice.
So it would have a different meaning if you look at it from a primary producer, which produces goods from the natural, from the Mother Earth or, from natural resources. If you look at, say, for example, a secondary business, which basically buys those natural material or goods, natural resources from a primary business and then reworks on it. It treats the raw material as input and works on it and then creates an output and sells it to the customer. And when you look at tertiary business, it might have a different, meaning or a connotation for it, because they would need to look at, can we afford a fair price? Can we afford, or can we not buy this as a product from somewhere else, which allows us to, not worry about fair price and fair trade. So there could be different meanings of this depending on, where and which part of the chain we look at, supply chain we look at for the aspect of or the definition of fair trade. Okay. But it is related to sustainability because in general, it means that you are being, you as a business are adapting, let's say, a practice which is going to be transparent and is going to respect, the trading conditions in a way wherein you are going to pay a fair price to the business or for a service that you're buying from somebody else. And that is where the fair trade or fair price as a concept, as a principle comes in.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Good stuff. So I will get this presentation, some of these articles and other bits up onto the Moodle, shortly after the presentation, and that should allow you to essentially look at, reading them further for the purposes of, understanding learning outcome 2. And we'll meet up again for the next session, which will be just covering the learning outcome 3 next week, and that would allow us to bring this unit to a close. So till then, thank you for joining, and I will see you next week.